Welcome, students. I'm Mr. Clark, and this is Chapter 23, Political Paralysis in the Gilded Age. The first section of that chapter is entitled, The Bloody Shirt Elects Grant. Ulysses S. Grant won a close presidential election in 1868 by reminding voters of the Civil War and Democrat support for the South. Here's a poster, an image of a poster that was used in that campaign. You'll notice that Grant is wearing what looks like a military uniform to remind voters that he was a war hero. Next slide. Next section is entitled The Era of Good Stealings. Grant's administration was one of the most corrupt in U.S. history. It was plagued by scandal, including the Credit Mobilier scandal. This Credit Mobilier scandal was one of many scandals. Here's a political cartoon referring to that scandal, which had to do with corruption involving the government and the railroad industry. Next slide. The next section is entitled The Liberal Republican Revolt of 1872. President Grant withstood a challenge from within his own party to win re-election. This is kind of an interesting election. A group of Republicans split away from Grant's faction and ran separately. The Democrats threw their support behind this candidate named Horace Greeley, but it didn't matter. Grant won a decisive victory and was reelected in spite of the scandal and so forth. Next slide. The next section is entitled Depression and Demands for Inflation. An economic downturn called the Panic of 1873 triggered a long debate about the nature of currency. The mid to late 1800s witnessed several economic downturns, including this one in 1873. This one had a lot of causes. It was in part caused by this overproduction in the railroad industry, among other things. Next slide. Pallid politics in the Gilded Age. Little aside from regional differences separated the two political parties during this period. Right after the Civil War, the Republicans pretty much dominated American politics, but by the mid-1870s, the Democrats were beginning to revive themselves, and this cartoon shows Republican symbol over here, the elephant, and the Democrat symbol, the donkey. Next slide. The next section is entitled The Hayes-Tilden Standoff of 1876. The disputed presidential election of 1876 created a crisis which could have triggered a second civil war. The 1876 election is one of, if not the closest elections in American history. And after a lot of turmoil and infighting and long process, a candidate kind of came out of nowhere, and his name was Rutherford B. Hayes. You see him riding a horse. He was given a nickname of the Dark Horse Candidate, and that term has entered our language. A dark horse is somebody that comes out of nowhere and wins, and that was certainly true of Hayes. Next slide. Hayes, the next section is entitled The Compromise of 1877 and the End of Reconstruction. A shady deal gave Hayes the presidency and removed federal troops from the South, thus ending Reconstruction. The Democrats and Republicans made a shady deal in 1877 to solve this close election between Hayes and Tilden. The Republicans were given the presidency, and Hayes became president. In return, the Republicans agreed to remove federal troops from the South, thus ending Reconstruction and beginning a new phase in this time in the South. Next slide. The next section is entitled The Birth of Jim Crow in the South. With the end of Reconstruction came the rise of discriminatory laws and groups in the South which targeted blacks. Among those groups were the Ku Klux Klan, as you see in this political cartoon. These, which would later become known as Jim Crow laws, established a system of segregation in the South which lasted for almost a century, and would be one of the most difficult and saddest periods in American history. Next slide. Class conflicts and ethnic clashes. Economic pressures led to ethnic conflicts. In groups such as the Irish and the Chinese faced increasing discrimination. During these economic crises, workers feared competition from new immigrants such as the Chinese. Here's a political cartoon showing a Chinese individual at the gates of the United States, and this notice here basically is telling him he's not welcome. And the first immigration restrictions would emerge during this period of time in American history. Next slide. The next section is entitled Garfield and Arthur. The assassination of James Garfield in 1881 by a disgruntled office seeker led to the beginning of reforming federal employment practices under the new president, Chester Arthur. Here's a cartoon showing, not a cartoon, here's a drawing showing the kind of a recreation of the shooting of Garfield. He's one of 4 American presidents who was assassinated, and his death really led to an examination of how government jobs are doled out, and that was a pretty important issue of that time. Next slide. The next section is entitled The Blaine Cleveland Mudslingers of 1884. Grover Cleveland was elected president in 1884 in one of the dirtiest campaigns in U.S. history. Here's a political cartoon showing Cleveland here and a woman holding a baby. One of the issues of that campaign was the fact that Cleveland had fathered a child out of wedlock, which was a no-no back then. And there was a slogan that the Republicans used against him, and it went this way: "Ma, ma, where's my pa? Gone to the White House, ha, ha, ha." Next slide. Next section is entitled Old Grover Takes Over. President Cleveland, and he was elected, was a proponent of laissez-faire economics and a lower tariff. The tariff was one of the most important issues of the day. By the way, a tariff is a tax on imports. And generally speaking, during this period, the Republicans supported a higher tariff, and the Democrats supported a lower tariff. Here you've got a drawing of political cartoon of Cleveland here, and he's holding something that says free trade. John Bull symbolizes Britain and their conflict about trade. Next slide. The next section is entitled The Republicans Return Under Harrison. Benjamin Harrison defeated Cleveland in 1888, and the Republicans raised the tariff. Here's a cartoon showing Harrison, and he's looks like he's trying to keep out imported goods. Next slide. The next section is entitled The Drumbeat of Discontent. The 1890s witnessed economic unrest and a series of strikes, including the Homestead strike and the rise of the Populist Party. Some of these strikes became quite violent, especially the Homestead strike. And here is a drawing of federal troops being called out to try to quell some of the violence between workers and their factory owners. Next slide. The next section is entitled Grover, Grim Times, and Gold. Cleveland is the only president to be reelected after having been voted out of office. He was reelected in 1892. His second term was plagued by an economic depression which began the next year in 1893. This chart shows how unemployment went up rapidly and remained rather high during much of the remainder of the 1890s. Thank you for listening.